if A, B, C, D, and E are integers and C times D times E is equal to 0, is D equal to 0? So if C times D times E is equal to 0, what is that telling us about C, D, and E? This means that at least one of these must be equal to 0, but it's also possible that all of them are equal to 0, or two of them could be equal to 0 and one of them could be something else, or just only one of them. So only C, only D, or only E. So we can think of this question, if is D equal to 0? Another way you could write that is, are C and E not equal to 0? Because if C and E are not equal to 0, and we know at least one of these must be equal to 0, then D has to be the 1. So either of these ways of thinking about the question are equivalent. Statement 1, A times B times C is equal to 30. So if A times B times C is equal to 30, then none of these guys can be equal to 0. So this means C cannot be equal to 0. Put it like that. So it's still possible that E is equal to 0 and D isn't equal to 0, or both D and E could be equal to 0, or only D could be equal to 0. So because of that, it's possible for D to be equal to 0 or not to be equal to 0. So this is insufficient. We need to know something about E. Statement 2 says A times C times E is equal to 0. So that just means one of these guys is equal to 0. And so this means, C could be equal to 0, E could be equal to 0, but that's not super helpful because D could either still be equal to 0 or could not be equal to 0. B is out, so then together, what do we know? So statement 1 tells us A, B, and C all cannot be equal to 0. So A cannot be equal to 0 here. C cannot be equal to 0 here. So together, this is telling me E must be equal to 0. So together, I know what? So C cannot be equal to 0. E must be equal to 0. But that doesn't mean necessarily D isn't equal to 0, because we can double up on our zeros, or D could be something else completely. Knowing that we have 1 0 really doesn't tell us anything about D. We need to know that we don't have zeros for our two other numbers. So this is still not sufficient, and E is the answer.